In August 1998, the highways of North Texas became the scene of a sudden and senseless double murder. Robert Everett, a 36-year-old truck driver from Missouri, was on the final stretch of his delivery route when he crossed paths with a man on a motorcycle. A man who, within minutes, would unleash a hail of bullets into his cab. Less than an hour later, 62-year-old Nicholas Velasquez, a tanker driver refueling at a quiet gas station, was gunned down from behind without warning. Two working men, strangers to each other, united in the worst possible way, both chosen at random, both executed in cold blood. The man behind the killings was Douglas Alan Feldman, a magna cum laude college graduate and former financial analyst whose life had spiraled into rage, violence, and an obsession with settling perceived wrongs on the road. His weapon of choice? A 9mm pistol. His motive? Pure, unrestrained anger. What followed was a high-stakes manhunt, disturbing letters boasting about the pleasure he took in killing, and a trial that exposed a side of Feldman few could have imagined. 14 years later, after countless appeals, it all ended in a quiet Texas death chamber, with Feldman's bizarre final statement echoing in the room just moments before the lethal injection. To understand how a well-educated professional transformed into a highway executioner, and why his last words still chill those who heard them, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon because this is one road rage case you'll never forget. Douglas Alan Feldman was born on June 19, 1958, and raised in Texas. In his early years he demonstrated significant academic ability, ultimately graduating magna cum laude from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, one of the state's most respected private universities. He entered the professional world as a financial analyst, a position that implied stability and control, yet underneath that polished exterior he carried a deepening instability, an explosive temper, and an inclination to turn ordinary conflicts into dangerous confrontations. Feldman's first documented offenses came during his teenage years. On May 31, 1974, he was found delinquent for credit card abuse and drug possession. He was committed to the Texas Youth Commission, TYC, but less than a day after being released from TYC custody, he was caught again in possession of marijuana. These early offenses already showed his readiness to defy the law and his resistance to rehabilitation. By 1978, Feldman had escalated into violent crime, earning convictions for aggravated robbery and narcotics possession. In one incident that year he entered Willow Creek Pharmacy in Richardson, Texas, asking about a specific tape. When the employee turned away, Feldman opened the counter gate, struck her in the head with what felt like a gun, and ordered her to get face down on the floor, threatening to kill her. He then held the pharmacist at gunpoint, demanding powerful drugs including Dilaudid, morphine, Percodan, and Seconal. After receiving the bag of drugs, Feldman fled the store, shouting threats. As he tried to leave the parking lot, his path was blocked by an incoming car, and he pointed his gun directly at the driver, forcing him to back away so he could escape. His pattern of aggression continued in later years. On May 31, 1996, at a motel parking lot in Dallas, a man told Feldman he had struck his girlfriend's car. Feldman deliberately slammed his own car door into the vehicle and remarked, "No, that's hitting her car door." When the man later testified about the event in court, Feldman called him a liar in front of the jury. A particularly violent encounter occurred on December 6, 1996, when Feldman, driving his Land Rover out of a parking lot, collided with a restored 1984 Pontiac Firebird in the Dallas area. Instead of stopping, he repeatedly slammed his brakes to provoke a collision. Eventually he stopped, exited his vehicle holding a ball-peen hammer, climbed onto the hood of the Firebird, smashed the windshield and door, reached into the driver's side, and struck the man inside at least 3 times in the head, threatening to kill him. He then reversed his Land Rover onto the hood before fleeing. The victim was hospitalized with a scalp contusion, and Feldman paid $6,500 to settle the resulting lawsuit. In another incident on May 1, 1998, at Keller's Hamburgers on Northwest Highway in Dallas, Feldman placed an order from his car but claimed he had no wallet when the food arrived. When told he could not have the food without paying, Feldman reached for something in his car, alarming the employee, then accelerated his vehicle directly toward her, striking her and running her over. She was thrown 20 feet, knocked unconscious, and suffered injuries including lost teeth and ongoing burning pain in her legs. Together, these episodes painted the portrait of a man who, despite an impressive education and a high-level career, repeatedly engaged in acts of violence, intimidation, and open defiance of the law. From theft to aggravated assault to armed robbery, Feldman's life was marked by a consistent readiness to threaten, harm, or overpower anyone who stood in his way, behavior that would ultimately foreshadow the killings of August 1998. It was just after nightfall on August 24, 1998, when the hum of engines and the steady rush of air along U.S. Highway 75 near Plano, Texas, was interrupted by the deep, throaty growl of a motorcycle cutting through the dark. Behind the handlebars was 40-year-old Douglas Alan Feldman, dressed in dark clothing, the kind of figure you might barely register in your peripheral vision before he disappeared into the night. But on this night, he wasn't riding with the anonymity of a commuter heading home. He was carrying with him a simmering rage and a loaded 9mm semi-automatic pistol, the weapon that would soon turn a minor traffic slight into a deadly ambush. Heading southbound in his 18-wheeler was Robert Everett, a 36-year-old truck driver from Missouri who was loved deeply by his family, known in his hometown as a hard worker, and accustomed to the grueling schedule of long-haul routes that kept him on the road for days at a time. Witnesses would later recall seeing Feldman's motorcycle and Everett's large white truck jockeying for position in the same lane, when, according to Feldman's own later claim, Everett cut him off, an act that in Feldman's mind was not a momentary inconvenience but a deep personal insult that demanded instant and lethal retribution. Fueled by that flash of anger, Feldman maneuvered his motorcycle alongside the cab of Everett's truck, his left hand gripping the handlebar while his right hand drew the pistol from his jacket. In one chillingly deliberate motion, he raised the weapon and fired directly through the driver's side window, the sharp cracks of the shots echoing across the otherwise monotonous hum of nighttime traffic. As glass shattered and Everett slumped in his seat, Feldman, showing a cold-blooded precision, ejected the spent magazine, reloaded on the move and fired again, ensuring that his target, now bleeding heavily and unable to react, had no chance of survival. The truck, robbed of its driver's control, began to drift before slowing to a stop against the shoulder. Everett had been struck multiple times in the torso and head. The wounds were catastrophic and death was instantaneous. Investigators would later confirm through ballistic evidence that all the shell casings found on the asphalt matched Feldman's weapon, and eyewitness accounts from motorists traveling that night described the startling image of a lone motorcyclist speeding away from the scene without hesitation, vanishing south toward Dallas as if nothing had happened. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of physical struggle, it was an execution carried out in seconds, with the kind of detached focus that revealed Feldman's capacity for sudden, lethal violence. And while most would consider such an act the violent climax of a night, for Feldman, it was merely the beginning. Within the hour he would strike again, leaving another man dead and North Texas law enforcement scrambling to connect the dots between two murders committed with the same weapon, the same modus operandi, and the same chilling disregard for human life. It had been less than an hour since Douglas Alan Feldman gunned down Robert Everett on the shoulder of U.S. Highway 75 in Plano, Texas. The scene of that first killing was still alive with flashing police lights and the arrival of stunned first responders when Feldman, instead of hiding from what he had done, accelerated into the warm August night, his motorcycle roaring beneath him as if it were the only thing in the world that could match the chaos in his head. The ride took him south, away from the highway, toward the quiet hum of a Dallas-area Exxon station. It was the kind of place that stayed open deep into the night, fluorescent lights bathing the gas pumps in a pale glow, the smell of diesel and gasoline lingering in the air, and the occasional traveler pulling in to refuel before continuing down the endless stretch of Texas road. On this night, one of those travelers was a 62-year-old tanker truck driver, methodically working to refuel his rig. He moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, likely thinking only about finishing the job and getting back on the road. Feldman pulled in silently on his motorcycle, the low rumble of the engine blending into the background noise of the station. But unlike the other motorists who came and went that evening, Feldman wasn't there for fuel. His mind was already set. Without hesitation, he dismounted, stepped toward the unsuspecting man, and closed the gap between them with a steady, deliberate pace. There was no shout, no warning, no indication that the two had ever met before, or that there was any reason for what was about to happen. In one swift movement, Feldman raised his 9mm pistol, aimed squarely at the man's back and pulled the trigger. The first round struck with brutal force, knocking the driver forward toward the tanker. A second shot slammed into him before he could even turn around. Feldman kept firing, 4 shots in total, each one echoing in the stillness of the night, each muzzle flash briefly illuminating the shocked, frozen stillness of the scene. The man crumpled onto the pavement, his body collapsing in the narrow space between the pump and his massive truck. The hiss of pressurized fuel and the faint scent of gunpowder filled the air. Inside the small convenience store attached to the station, customers and the clerk ducked instinctively, their eyes darting toward the glass windows, unsure if the shooter would come for them next. But Feldman didn't linger. He didn't even check to see if his victim was alive. With the same cold composure that had carried him into the station, he turned, mounted his motorcycle, and rode off into the darkness. In less than a minute he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a body, spent shell casings, and a community that would soon be gripped by fear once they learned that 2 murders had been committed in less than an hour by the same unknown gunman. When investigators arrived, they immediately began drawing connections. The witnesses' descriptions of the shooter's motorcycle and build matched the reports from the earlier highway killing. The ballistics from the shell casings left on the concrete would later confirm the truth. The same gun that had ended Robert Everett's life had just been used to kill again. This time at random, with no personal motive, no heat-of-the-moment provocation, and no mercy whatsoever. It had been just under 2 weeks since Douglas Alan Feldman's late-night killing spree on August 24, 1998, and the Dallas-Fort Worth area was still on edge. Police had yet to identify the gunman, but they knew one thing for certain. He was still out there, armed, unpredictable, and willing to kill without hesitation. On the evening of September 5th, the tension in the air would turn to reality once again when Feldman, riding his motorcycle, found himself near a fast food restaurant. The summer night was thick with heat, neon signs flickering above the parking lot, and the low hum of idling engines as people waited in drive-through lines. It was an ordinary scene, but Feldman's presence instantly transformed it into the setting for yet another act of senseless violence. Among the patrons that night was a man named Antonio Vega, who had no connection to Feldman, no history, and no reason to be targeted. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Vega moved near his vehicle, Feldman, without a single word exchanged, produced his firearm and opened fire. The shots rang out sharply against the backdrop of traffic noise and muffled conversations from inside the restaurant. One round struck Vega, wounding him and sending him to the ground in shock and pain. The parking lot erupted into chaos as bystanders scrambled for cover, some ducking behind cars, others bolting toward the restaurant doors for safety. But amid the panic, one quick-thinking witness did something extraordinary. Instead of fleeing entirely, they locked their eyes on the fleeing gunman's motorcycle. As Feldman accelerated away from the scene, the witness managed to make out the sequence of numbers and letters on his license plate, committing it to memory and scribbling it down before calling 911. That single act, seemingly small in the chaos, would become the critical turning point in the investigation. For the first time, authorities had a concrete lead that could connect the gunman to a real identity. Within hours, police traced the plate to an address in the Dallas area. Armed with this information, officers moved in. The arrest was swift, taking place at Feldman's own home. When officers searched the property, they uncovered exactly the kind of evidence that confirmed their worst suspicions. 2 firearms, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, over 300 in total, and other items that painted the picture of a man not only capable of the recent shootings, but actively prepared for more. After Douglas Alan Feldman was taken into custody and the ballistics tied his weapon to 3 separate shootings, investigators began combing through every inch of evidence, searching for anything that might explain what had driven an educated, once successful financial analyst to stalk highways and gas stations like a predator. What they found next didn't just answer that question. It shocked even the most seasoned detectives. In the days following his arrest, prosecutors obtained a series of personal writings Feldman had sent to a former girlfriend. These weren't casual letters, nor were they the ramblings of a man in emotional turmoil. They were cold, deliberate, and disturbingly candid accounts of his inner thoughts. In these letters, Feldman spoke openly about the killings, not with regret or shame, but with an unmistakable sense of satisfaction. He described the events almost like trophies, replaying the moments in his mind as though savoring them. He admitted that he had enjoyed the act of taking lives, detailing the adrenaline rush and the control it gave him. There was no attempt to soften the truth for his reader. Feldman wanted it known that the murders were not accidents or impulses born of fleeting anger. They were deliberate choices, moments he relished, and he seemed to take pride in committing them. But the most chilling revelation came when Feldman outlined the fantasies that still churned in his mind, even from behind bars. He wrote about how the killings had not quenched his violent desires, but instead had awakened something darker, a hunger to do more. In one of his most infamous statements, Feldman declared that if given the chance, he would have continued his spree without hesitation, and that he wished he had the means to take it further. His words became etched in the case's narrative. If I had a button to kill every person on this planet, I would push it. It was the kind of sentiment that strips away any lingering doubt about whether the man was capable of remorse. When these letters were presented in court, they became a devastating weapon for the prosecution. Jurors could see in Feldman's own handwriting that the killings were premeditated, calculated, and fueled not by momentary rage, but by a deep-seated desire to inflict harm. The letters showed a man who not only refused to feel guilt, but who embraced his identity as a killer, almost as if it were a personal calling. Prosecutors argued that this lack of empathy, combined with his fantasies of mass destruction, made him one of the most dangerous individuals they had ever brought to trial. And as the words were read aloud, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, because there was no way to reconcile them with the image of the clean-cut, magna cum laude graduate Feldman had once been. In August of 1999, nearly a full year after the deadly spree that left 2 men dead and a third gravely wounded, Douglas Alan Feldman walked into a Texas courtroom to stand trial for capital murder, the weight of the state's case pressing down on him from the moment jury selection began. The prosecution was ready to deliver a narrative as sharp and unflinching as the gunfire that had echoed through the Plano and Dallas nights, armed with forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the defendant's own chilling letters. The charge was capital murder, and from the start, the stakes could not have been higher. If the jury found him guilty, the question of his life or death would hang in their hands. From the first day, the jury was given a glimpse into Feldman's past, a past the law normally shields from them during the guilt-innocence phase under Texas Rule 404B, which limits the introduction of prior bad acts to prevent unfair prejudice. But once the guilty verdict came into play, the courtroom door swung wide open to his history of violence, and prosecutors wasted no time bringing it all out. They recounted incidents from as far back as the 1970s. Armed robberies at pharmacies, assaults with a hammer in parking lots, credit card fraud, drug possession, and even a hit-and-run that left a woman hospitalized. This wasn't just about painting Feldman as dangerous, it was about showing that his violent tendencies were not sudden or isolated, but part of a long, disturbing pattern that had persisted for decades. The defense, for their part, tried to find cracks in the narrative. They focused on the second killing, the shooting of the tanker driver at the Exxon station, suggesting there might have been some unknown motive or provocation, perhaps even a misunderstanding. But the court was not moved. The judge ruled the argument irrelevant, pointing out that nothing in the evidence supported a connection between Feldman and his victim. It was a killing without justification, an act of pure rage, and the jury was instructed to weigh it as such. In a capital murder trial, where deliberations often hinge on motive, the absence of one made the crime even more chilling. When it came time for sentencing, the jury's task was clear: determine whether Douglas Alan Feldman posed a continuing threat to society, even within the confines of a prison cell, and whether there were any mitigating circumstances that could justify sparing his life. After hearing his own words in the letters, professing enjoyment in killing, fantasizing about doing it again, and even wishing he could wipe out humanity, the answer was unanimous. Feldman was sentenced to die by lethal injection, the ultimate penalty in Texas's justice system. It was a decision that reflected not only the gravity of his crimes but the deep unease his lack of remorse stirred in everyone who heard his case. The legal battle did not end there. Feldman's attorneys launched a series of appeals, challenging everything from procedural issues to the constitutionality of the death penalty itself. The case wound its way through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals into federal court, and finally up to the United States Supreme Court. Each time the result was the same: the conviction and sentence stood. No higher authority would intervene, no last-minute legal technicality would spare him. As the appeals failed one by one, the calendar inched ever closer to the date when Douglas Alan Feldman would meet the same finality he had delivered to his victims on those hot summer nights in 1998. For the next 14 years, Douglas Alan Feldman lived behind the steel doors and razor wire of Texas's most infamous address, death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, a place where the state houses those it has marked for execution. From the moment he arrived, he was not just another inmate awaiting the slow march of appeals. He was known among staff and prisoners alike as a man whose temper had not cooled and whose convictions, both criminal and personal, remained locked in the same unyielding grip that had fueled his crimes. The sterile, windowless cells of Polunsky are designed for control. Each prisoner isolated 23 hours a day in a space no larger than a bathroom, meals slid through a narrow slot, exercise limited to a small, caged yard, and all human contact kept at a distance. Yet within this tight regimen, Feldman developed a reputation for being difficult, openly defiant with guards, quick to challenge rules, and never showing the signs of introspection or remorse that some condemned men slowly adopt as the years pass. To prison staff, it became clear that Feldman had not softened in his isolation. He wrote letters and spoke in ways that made it obvious he still saw his actions not as criminal, but as justified acts of retribution against a world he believed had wronged him. Even after more than a decade of watching other death row inmates leave for the execution chamber, he maintained the chilling conviction that his killings were not only deliberate but righteous. While many on death row are haunted by regret, seeking religion or reconciliation, Feldman held to his beliefs with a kind of cold certainty, refusing to recast his crimes as mistakes and never extending the words, "I'm sorry," toward the families of the dead. His stance alienated him from some inmates and infuriated others, but it also cemented his identity as one of the row's most unrepentant residents. The years were marked by the grinding monotony of appeals and court filings, each rejection pulling him a little closer to the lethal injection chamber in Huntsville. Still, Feldman showed no outward signs of fear or desperation. If anything, he appeared to wear his impending execution as an inevitability he had already made peace with. For guards who watched hundreds of men come and go over the years, his unwavering demeanor was striking. There was no bargaining, no visible breaking down, no last-minute pivot toward remorse. Instead, Douglas Alan Feldman's 14 years on Texas death row unfolded like the long, quiet tale of a storm that had already spent its fury, leaving only the cold and unnerving presence of a man who, even facing his own death, refused to let go of the beliefs that had put him there. By the morning of July 31, 2013, Douglas Alan Feldman had reached the end of his 14-year stay on Texas's death row, a stretch of time defined by courtroom battles, appeals that climbed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and an unshakable belief, at least in his mind, that his actions in August of 1998 had been justified. The date of execution had been set, the hour was approaching, and inside the Polunsky unit, the final sequence of his life was underway. Texas had ended the practice of allowing inmates to request a special last meal 2 years earlier, but in Feldman's case that rule made no difference. He didn't want one. Offered the standard prison tray, he declined it completely, choosing instead to go to his death on an empty stomach, a silent rejection of any final comfort the system might offer. For a man who had spent much of his life asserting control in volatile, destructive ways, it seemed fitting that his last personal decision was to consume nothing at all. Later that day, Feldman was transferred from Polunsky to the Walls unit in Huntsville, the historic red brick prison where Texas carries out all of its executions. Once inside, the process was methodical and unflinching. A review of paperwork, a last chance for spiritual counsel, and the short, deliberate walk to the death chamber. There, under the glare of bright fluorescent lights and the hum of the ventilation system, he was strapped to the gurney. When prompted for his final words, Feldman did not seek forgiveness, offer closure to the families of the men he had killed, or reflect on his life. Instead, his voice was calm, almost judicial, as he issued a declaration that seemed to invert reality. "I hereby declare Robert Stephen Everett and Nicholas Velasquez guilty of crimes against me, Douglas Alan Feldman. Either by fact or by proxy, I find them both guilty. I hereby sentence both of them to death, which I carried out in August of 1998. As of that time, the state of Texas has been holding me illegally in confinement and by force for 15 years. I hereby protest my pending execution and demand immediate relief." The words landed like a final verdict, not against himself but against his victims, underscoring his lack of remorse. At exactly 6:17 p.m., the lethal injection began. The clear liquid entered his veins as witnesses stood silently on the other side of the glass, the quiet punctuated only by the mechanical rhythm of the procedure. Feldman lay still, showing no visible struggle, his expression unchanged from the moment he began speaking. At 6:28 p.m., 11 minutes later, Douglas Alan Feldman was pronounced dead. Outside the Walls unit, the summer heat was beginning to fade with the setting sun, while inside, the gurney was readied for the next name on the state's list, his place in Texas's long history of executions sealed forever. If this deep dive into one of Texas's most jaw-dropping true crime cases left you stunned, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start the conversation. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up, it helps more people discover these stories. Share it with friends who love a true crime mystery that stays with you long after the screen fades to black. And of course, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next deep, detailed, and absolutely unforgettable look into the darkest corners of real-life crime. The next case might just be even more unbelievable than this one.